Unrest is growing in China over the country's strict COVID-19 measures. Fresh protests have broken out in major cities, with hundreds rallying at Beijing's elite Tsing-hua University, chanting, "We want freedom." Many also holding up blank sheets of paper in a symbolic protest against state censorship. More demonstrations have also been reported in Shanghai following clashes with police overnight. Public anger has flared after a deadly apartment block fire, with many blaming an ongoing lockdown for hampering rescue efforts. Chinese officials have defended their zero-COVID policy despite the growing public backlash.
They've become a symbol of the biggest threat yet to China's leadership. Blank pieces of paper held aloft by protesters, like here in Beijing, a silent rejection of censorship. This rally, just one of dozens that have spread across China. Just hours earlier, huge crowds turned out in Shanghai in a rare defiance of Chinese authorities. Years of pandemic lockdowns have pushed people here to their limit. Hundreds faced down police and called on President Xi Jinping to step down. Many in the crowd refusing to hide their identities, despite potentially severe consequences for their disobedience. Scuffles eventually broke out, with officers warning the crowds to move back. As police reinforcements arrived, a woman can be heard yelling, "You are employees. You have food to eat and money to make. What about us? It's been 3 years." Saturday's protests came to a head following a candlelit vigil for the victims of an apartment fire that's shaken the country. At least 10 died in the blaze, which broke out on Thursday in the northwestern city of Urumqi. Many have blamed the deaths on lockdown restrictions, which they say hampered rescue efforts. With some locals banned from leaving their homes for over 3 months, Urumqi residents are now also rising up. Here they chant, "Lift the COVID lockdown." The tension with officials boils over as protesters break through a fence. The protests come just weeks after Xi Jinping was reappointed as the country's leader for an unprecedented third term. His COVID restrictions are some of the harshest globally, with officials sticking to a zero-COVID policy while much of the rest of the world tries to coexist with the virus. But despite the public backlash, Xi shows no signs of backing down.
And we can talk now to correspondent Fabian Kretschmer, who is in Beijing. Fabian, first of all, what more can you tell us about the situation there?
Yeah, we're basically seeing the biggest protests in China since at least the 1990s. It's really remarkable. In the night from Saturday to Sunday, several hundreds of young people in Shanghai gathered. They did not only voice their criticism against the zero-COVID policy, but also against Xi Jinping's rule. They were shouting, "Down with Xi Jinping, down with the party." I mean, that's really unheard of. And you have protests in basically all of the country. I'll give you one noticeable example here in Beijing. At the really very prestigious Tsing-hua University. Also several hundreds, maybe even more than 1,000 students are gathering, also shouting slogans, demanding freedom. And it's really, I mean, they are very courageous. They are basically for the first time speaking up, and that comes really at a great risk.
And, I mean, the Chinese government is known to have a very low tolerance for criticism. What does it tell us that so many are willing now to defy the regime, to be courageous, as you just said?
Yeah, many have had enough. They feel also like they have nothing to lose. I would say there are different motifs, especially, let's say, migrant workers. For them, the lockdowns are an existential economic threat. So really, they have nothing to lose. For the students, for example, at Tsing-hua University, for them, I'm sure it's a moral obligation. They want to show solidarity because on Thursday night, there was a fire in Urumqi in Xinjiang. 10 people died, and many people in China believe those deaths could have been prevented. They were basically a side effect effect of those very excessive lockdowns. And it's not the first time that people had to die because of those lockdowns. Basically, every day on social media, you see people like desperate, suiciding, jumping from their roofs because they've been, for weeks, sometimes months, locked down in their homes. So they had the feeling now it's too much. We have to show our solidarity. We have to say something.
And do you think that easing China's tough COVID restrictions would be enough to satisfy protesters, or is there really maybe something deeper going on?
For some, yes. I mean, in Shanghai, we've really seen that they want more than just a change of the COVID pandemic policy. I mean, they basically asked Xi Jinping to step down. I mean, for them, the endless repressions, the surveillance that, came during the pandemic, but was also observable before. I think they want a different society. I'm sure about that. But also for many other people, it's really mostly the endless COVID lockdowns that, brings their patience to an end. Here in Beijing, for example, I followed one, residential compound. They, fought their way to outside of those barriers that they had in front of their lockdown compound, and they see the problem more with local neighborhood committees who abuse their power. They wanted to call the police, wanted to call the authorities because they actually had trust in them that they would, correct those things. So there's really a mixed bag of motifs behind those protesters, but all of them definitely had enough of zero COVID.
Right. I mean, Fabian, that is sort of obviously, makes you wonder why is Xi Jinping insisting on these very rigid COVID measures, given the low numbers there, let alone the economic and what we see now, also the social backlash?
Yeah, that's really a complicated question because, nobody knows 100% for sure. But I would say that, the government has put itself in a dead end. We have for more than 2 years an endless propaganda telling that there's no alternative to zero COVID, that China is the only place that managed to, contain the virus. And now we see that this strategy is not sustainable anymore, and they don't know how to change it. And in the last months, actually, for more than a year, there's so much resources in endless testing and quarantine facilities, and they failed to start a nationwide vaccine campaign. Now the people over 80 years old, there's a rate of less than 40% who had a booster shot. So if now we would open up completely, I'm sure there would be a lot of damage to the people in terms of health. So now it's really, there's not good options left.
Right. Correspondent Fabian Kretschmer there reporting for us from Beijing. Thank you so much, Fabian.